And finally, he told me, look, they do it. They are going to make a big film for television, 6 hours, on the story of Jesus.
For nearly 50 years, a silent pact held the secrets of the Tunisian desert at bay. We thought we knew everything about the 1977 masterpiece that defined the face of divinity for billions. But as 2026 arrived, the remaining survivors of the production finally broke their silence. What they revealed wasn't just a collection of behind-the-scenes anecdotes. It was a haunting truth about a production that blurred the line between cinematic art and a terrifying, otherworldly reality. Truth behind those Christ-like eyes. The world was not ready for Robert Powell. When Franco Zepharelli first began scouting for his Messiah, he wasn't looking for a man with piercing blue eyes and a gaunt, ethereal frame. In fact, he originally had his sights set on Al Pacino or Dustin Hoffman, actors who could bring a gritty, grounded realism to the role of a revolutionary. But the moment Powell walked into the room, something shifted. It wasn't just his talent, it was an aura that felt dangerously detached from the modern world. However, as soon as the news leaked that a British actor known for more secular, intense roles was to play the Son of God, a firestorm erupted. Religious groups were up in arms, threatening to boycott the entire production before a single frame had been shot. They wanted a saint. What they got was a man who smoked too much and had a reputation for playing darker, more cynical characters. Zepharelli, a man known for his flamboyant confidence, didn't flinch. He saw something in Powell that no one else did, a blank canvas upon which the world could project its faith. But to achieve this, the director imposed a set of rules that bordered on the psychological. The most famous of these was the no-blink rule. Zepharelli realized that if Jesus looked like a normal man, blinking away the dust of the desert, the spell of his divinity would be broken. He commanded Powell to keep his eyes open for as long as humanly possible during every take. It was an agonizing requirement. Under the harsh lights and the dry wind, Powell's eyes would burn and water, but he held the gaze. This simple physical trick created a supernatural effect on screen. When you watch the film, those blue eyes seemed to pierce right through the television set and into the viewer's soul. It wasn't just acting, it was a physical endurance test that began to separate Powell from his own identity. To further the illusion, the makeup department worked in secret to create a look that was both human and celestial. They used a specific shade of dark blue eyeliner on the upper lids and a thin line of white on the bottom to make the eyes appear larger, more luminous, and almost constantly tearful. It gave him the appearance of someone who was perpetually seeing a world that no one else could perceive. The pressure on Powell was immense. He was a man who enjoyed his life, his drinks, and his privacy, yet he was being asked to embody the ultimate moral compass. He began to feel the weight of the expectations from the crew and the local extras, who started treating him with a reverence that felt increasingly suffocating. He was no longer just an actor on a job. He was becoming a vessel for an ancient story that demanded total surrender. This surrender, however, was only the beginning of a transformation that would eventually push him to the brink of physical collapse. It wasn't just the eyes that were haunting, it was the physical suffering the actors endured under the blistering Tunisian sun. The weight of a mission. This time, we reveal the truth behind the effective physical appearance and countenance of Powell, Christ in the show. The production moved to Tunisia, a landscape that was as beautiful as it was unforgiving. Zepharelli wasn't interested in a comfortable studio shoot. He wanted the dust, the heat, and the visceral grit of the first century. What the cast and crew didn't realize was that the environment would become a character in itself, one that demanded a high price. The heat was a constant, suffocating blanket, often soaring past 110 degrees Fahrenheit. For the actors draped in heavy, authentic wool robes, every hour on set was a battle against dehydration and heat stroke. But for Robert Powell, the physical demands went far beyond enduring the sun. To prepare for the Sermon on the Mount and the eventual journey to Golgotha, Powell underwent a transformation that many now are finally describing as a form of voluntary torture. He didn't just want to look thin, he wanted to look like a man consumed by a divine fire, a man whose body was literally being wasted away by the weight of his mission. So what did he do and sacrifice for this role. Under the strict guidance of the production, Powell embarked on a specialized diet that was almost entirely devoid of substance. For 12 days leading up to the most pivotal scenes, he reportedly consumed nothing but tiny portions of cheese and water. He wanted his ribcage to protrude and his cheeks to hollow out so that the shadows of the desert would play across his face like a living corpse. When he walked onto the set for the crucifixion, he was so weak that he had to be supported between takes. The crew, usually a boisterous group of Italian and British technicians, fell into a deathly silence. They weren't looking at a movie star anymore. They were looking at a man who had pushed his physical form to the absolute limit. This wasn't Hollywood magic or prosthetic makeup. This was the real, raw consequence of a man starving himself to meet the expectations of an icon. The atmosphere on set became heavy, with an almost religious dread. People began to whisper that the production was becoming too real, that the line between a cinematic recreation and a spiritual event had been permanently crossed. The truth that has emerged in recent years is the psychological toll this environment took on everyone involved. Actors were living in remote locations, far from the comforts of home, surrounded by the very history they were trying to recreate. The local extras, many of whom were devout, didn't always see the cameras. They saw a man who looked like the icons in their churches, walking among them, healing the sick, and speaking of the end of days. This blurred reality created a strange tension. If an actor stepped out of character to smoke a cigarette or share a joke, the locals would react with genuine shock and sometimes anger. They were trapped in a living theater where the stakes were eternal. This pressure cooker of heat, hunger, and heightened emotion turned the set into a place of strange occurrences, unexplained silences, sudden winds that seemed to pick up at the exact moment a line of scripture was delivered, and a sense that they were all being watched by something larger than the lenses of the cameras. The suffering wasn't just a byproduct of the location. It was the fuel for the performances. When you see the pain in the eyes of the apostles or the exhaustion on the face of the Virgin Mary, you aren't just seeing great acting. You are seeing the result of months spent in a wasteland, fighting the elements and the mental strain of trying to be holy in a place that felt like purgatory. The crew members who have finally spoken out in 2026 describe a production that felt less like a job and more like a pilgrimage through fire. They speak of the scars, both physical and emotional, that they carried home with them. It was a baptism of sand and sweat that bonded the cast in a way few other films ever have. But as the cameras finally stopped rolling and the dust began to settle, a new and perhaps more terrifying reality began to set in for the man at the center of it all. While the crew struggled with the heat, Robert Powell was dealing with a transformation that would ensure he could never walk down a street unnoticed again. The shadow of the cross. Robert Powell walked away from the Tunisian desert thinking he was leaving the character behind, but he soon discovered that the world had other plans. In the years following the 1977 release, the image of his face, those haunting, unblinking eyes, and the structured, hollowed cheekbones became the literal face of Jesus for an entire generation.
Immediately after I'd finished the film, I ran away from the part very much. The first thing I did when I got home was shave my beard off and cut my hair. So I still don't know. Yes, I do believe in Jesus Christ.
It was printed on prayer cards, hung in cathedrals, and framed on the walls of homes from South America to the Philippines. For Powell, this wasn't just a career milestone. It was a professional death sentence. He had achieved the impossible by making himself a vessel for the divine. But in doing so, he had erased Robert Powell, the actor. Every role he took afterward was scrutinized through the lens of his performance as the Messiah. Casting directors found it nearly impossible to place him in a gritty thriller or a romantic comedy because the audience couldn't stop seeing the man from the cross. He had reached the pinnacle of fame, yet he was trapped in a golden cage of his own making. The reality that Powell has touched on in more recent reflections is the profound sense of isolation that followed. He wasn't just an actor who had played a part, he had become a living icon, and people expected him to live up to that impossible standard. If he was spotted in a pub having a pint, it felt like a scandal. If he expressed a cynical thought, it felt like heresy. The psychological weight of carrying that image for decades took a toll that few understood. He became a man who preferred the shadows, finding solace in voiceover work and the occasional stage play where he could hide his famous face behind the distance of a proscenium arch. By this year, the reflection on his life reveals a man who has finally made peace with his ghost. He acknowledges that while the role took away his anonymity and perhaps a traditional Hollywood career, it gave him a legacy that will outlive any blockbuster. He remains the only man who can say he looked into the eyes of the world as their savior and saw them look back with genuine, terrifying belief. As he aged, Powell's features softened, but the piercing intensity remained. He spent much of his later years involved in literary pursuits and narrating documentaries, using that resonant, familiar voice to guide audiences through history. But even in his 70s and 80s, the letters from fans never stopped. They didn't ask for his autograph because they liked his work. They wrote to him as if he were a spiritual confidant, sharing their deepest traumas and their most fervent prayers. He had to learn how to navigate the bizarre reality of being a human being who was also a permanent symbol of hope for millions of strangers. It was a lonely path, one that required a thick skin and a quiet dignity. He never leaned into the celebrity of it, never tried to monetize the spiritual connection people felt toward him, which only added to the mystery and the reverence that continues to surround him today. Powell wasn't the only one carrying a heavy burden. The young woman playing his mother was fighting her own internal battles under the veil. The Virgin's Burden. Olivia Hussey was only 25 when she was cast as Mary, the mother of Jesus, but she already carried the weight of a global icon.
The 15-year-old Olivia was chosen to portray Juliet in Zepharelli's film adaptation of Romeo and Juliet, released in 1968.
Having starred as Juliet in Zeffirelli's 1968 masterpiece, she was the director's muse. But the transition from the world's most famous lover to the world's most famous mother was a psychological gauntlet. While Powell had to embody divinity, Hussey had to embody a grief that was cosmic in scale. On the set in Tunisia, she found herself retreating into a space of profound silence. She wasn't just playing a role. She was navigating the expectations of billions of women who looked to Mary as the ultimate symbol of purity and maternal suffering. The fact revealed in her later reflections and the recent retrospectives is that the production didn't just demand her talent, it demanded her emotional marrow. She spent weeks in a state of perpetual mourning, weeping until her eyes were swollen and her voice was a mere rasp, all to capture the raw agony of a mother watching her son's slow execution. The impact on Hussey's life was immediate and lasting. Much like Powell, she found that the industry struggled to see her as anything other than a saintly figure. She had captured a specific kind of ethereal, tragic beauty that made contemporary roles feel shallow by comparison. Off-camera, Hussey struggled with the immense pressure of her early fame and the intensity of the Jesus of Nazareth shoot. She often spoke of the Zepharelli energy, a demanding, almost religious fervor that left his actors feeling spiritually drained. In the years that followed, she sought a life away from the blinding lights of Hollywood, focusing on her family and her own spiritual path. Now, her story is seen as one of survival. She moved through the trauma of being a child star and the intensity of the biblical epic to find a quiet strength, often appearing in later years to speak about mental health and the importance of finding one's identity outside of the characters they portray. The connection between Hussey and the audience remains one of the strongest in cinema history. Her portrayal of Mary at the foot of the cross is often cited as the most moving ever filmed, largely because she refused to play it with a distant, holy detachment. She played it as a woman losing her child. This humanity is what made the film so dangerous to some and so beloved by others. It stripped away the gold-leafed icons of the church and replaced them with a girl who was terrified, exhausted, and broken. Even decades later, Hussey remains a figure of immense grace, acknowledging that while the role was a heavy veil to wear, it allowed her to touch the lives of people in their darkest moments of loss. She became a mother to the world, a title that brought both a sense of pride and a lingering, quiet exhaustion that she has only recently begun to fully articulate. While Mary offered the heart of the film, the story needed a soul to sell it out, and they found it in a man who redefined the ultimate traitor. The human traitor. Ian McShane did not want to play a monster. When he signed on to play Judas Iscariot, he was stepping into the shoes of the most hated man in human history. Traditionally, Judas was portrayed as a one-dimensional villain, a man driven by simple greed or demonic possession. But McShane and Zepharelli wanted something far more dangerous. A man who was deeply intellectual, politically motivated, and ultimately, tragically mistaken. The truth that McShane has often discussed in the decades since, and which has become a focal point of the new retrospectives, is that his Judas was the most modern character in the entire epic. He was a man who wanted a revolution, a man who believed that the Messiah should be a king of swords rather than a king of peace. This nuanced approach required McShane to live in a state of constant internal conflict on set, acting as the bridge between the audience's skepticism and the film's spiritual fervor. The filming of the betrayal was a grueling experience that left McShane emotionally raw. He had to find the humanity in a man who would eventually take his own life out of sheer, unadulterated regret. To prepare for the final scenes, McShane isolated himself from the rest of the cast, avoiding the camaraderie that usually forms during a long shoot. He wanted to feel the growing distance between himself and the group, mirroring Judas's own descent into paranoia and desperation. When the cameras finally captured his it wasn't just a plot point. It was a visceral explosion of grief that stunned the crew. Today, critics are pointing to this performance as the turning point for McShane's career. It proved he could play men who were morally compromised, yet undeniably charismatic, a skill he would later use to dominate television in roles like Al Swearingen in Deadwood. Today, McShane looks back on the production with a mixture of professional pride and a touch of his trademark wit. He survived the heat and the heavy theological weight of the project, emerging as one of the few cast members whose career wasn't completely swallowed by the biblical genre. While Powell became a symbol and Hussey became an icon, McShane became a legend of the craft. He managed to shake off the curse of the desert by leaning into his own darkness, using the intensity he discovered in Tunisia to fuel a decades-long run of magnificent villains. Yet, even he admits that the memory of that set, the silence of the dunes, and the eerie, unblinking eyes of Robert Powell never truly left him. It was a production that demanded more than just lines. It demanded a piece of the actor's soul, and McShane was one of the few who knew how to trade it for a legacy of greatness. While Judas provided the friction on the ground, the halls of power were being filled by a group of legends who turned the Sanhedrin into a den of lions. The power of the Sanhedrin. To build a world that felt as heavy as history itself, Zepharelli knew he couldn't rely on bit players to populate the seats of power. He needed titans. The Sanhedrin and the Roman leadership were filled with a staggering assembly of acting royalty. Christopher Plummer as Herod Antipas, Anthony Quinn as Caiaphas, and James Mason as Joseph of Arimathea. These weren't just guest appearances. They were intentional choices to show that the world Jesus inhabited was one of immense intellectual and political pressure. In the retrospectives, the revelations being rediscovered is the sheer competitive electricity on those sets. You had multiple Oscar winners sharing cramped, dusty spaces, each bringing their own distinct methodology to a story that most of them had known since childhood. Anthony Quinn, in particular, brought a ferocious, grounded authority to Caiaphas, viewing him not as a cartoonish villain, but as a man desperately trying to preserve his nation under the boot of Rome. Christopher Plummer's portrayal of Herod remains one of the most chilling aspects of the production. He played the king with a decadent, bored cruelty that made the stakes of the gospel feel terrifyingly real. Behind the scenes, the veterans formed a sort of elite club, often retreating to local villas to escape the desert heat and discuss the craft of acting over expensive wine. For the younger actors, seeing these legends navigate the brutal conditions was a masterclass in professional endurance. They didn't complain about the sand in their costumes or the long hours. They treated the text with the same reverence they would a Shakespearean tragedy. This gravitas is exactly what has allowed the film to age so much better than the Technicolor biblical epics of the 50s. These men weren't playing Bible characters. They were playing politicians, judges, and kings who were watching their world shift beneath their feet. The legacy of these icons in 2026 is one of unmatched standard setting. Most of these men have since passed on, leaving Jesus of Nazareth as one of the final times so much theatrical power was concentrated in a single project. Christopher Plummer, who continued to act into his 90s, often looked back at the shoot as a unique moment in cinema where the scale of the production actually matched the talent involved. They provided the necessary friction. Without the immense weight of the Sanhedrin, Powell's performance would have lacked its counterpoint. They were the mountain that the Messiah had to climb. This concentration of power created a professional tension on set that forced everyone to elevate their game, turning what could have been a standard television miniseries into a cinematic event that felt like it was being etched into stone.
This is a mesmerizing miniseries. It covers Jesus' life in great depth and great detail, which you would expect in 6.5 hours.
The director's obsession with this perfection, however, was not without its own brand of divine madness that nearly broke the crew. Zepharelli's obsession. Franco Zeffirelli was not merely directing a television project, he was conducting a séance with history. The accounts from surviving crew members paint a picture of a man possessed by a vision that bordered on the fanatical. Zeffirelli, a devout Catholic and a perfectionist of the highest order, treated every frame as if it were a Renaissance fresco. He would spend hours adjusting the fold of a garment or waiting for the sun to hit a specific sand dune at a precise angle to mimic the lighting of a Caravaggio painting. This obsession created an atmosphere of divine madness on set. He pushed his actors to the brink of emotional and physical exhaustion, believing that only through genuine suffering could they touch the sublime. The truth that has surfaced in recent years is that Zeffirelli often viewed his actors as colors on a palette rather than human beings with limits, leading to high-tension standoffs in the middle of the desert. The director's demand for authenticity was absolute. He insisted on using ancient techniques for building sets and demanded that the extras, many of whom were local Tunisians, behave as though they were living in the 1st century even when the cameras weren't rolling. He was known to scream at the top of his lungs if he spotted a modern wristwatch or a plastic bottle anywhere near the frame, feeling that such impurities would break the spiritual seal of the film. This intensity trickled down to every department. The costume designers had to source specific wools that would itch and hang with the weight of antiquity, and the cinematographers were forced to invent new ways to capture the natural light of North Africa to give the film its golden, timeless glow. Zeffirelli wasn't just making a movie. He was trying to capture a miracle on film, and he didn't care whose spirit he bruised to get there. Despite his volatile temperament, Zeffirelli's obsession is exactly why the film remains the gold standard nearly 50 years later. He had a gift for spotting the divine in the mundane. He famously claimed that he didn't choose the actors, but that God chose them, a sentiment that made the production feel like a predestined event. This sense of destiny gave the cast a strange kind of stamina. Even as they grumbled about his demands, they recognized that they were part of something that transcended the medium of television. Zeffirelli's madness was infectious. It turned a crew of cynical professionals into a collective of believers, all working toward a singular aesthetic epiphany. This time, we see his work not just as a directorial feat, but as an act of faith that required a heavy toll from everyone who stepped into his orbit. While the director's vision was being carved into film, the world was preparing to receive a production that would change the landscape of religious media forever. The global phenomenon and the final revelation. When the dust finally settled on the Tunisian plains and the thousands of feet of film were hauled back to the editing suites of Europe, no one could have predicted the sheer magnitude of the shockwave that was about to hit. In 1977, when the miniseries premiered, the world didn't just watch a television show, it experienced a collective cultural arrest. For billions of people across the globe, the images captured in that desert became the definitive visual language of the New Testament. The truth that has become so apparent by now is that Zeffirelli didn't just create a successful movie. He created a permanent replacement for the human imagination. Before this film, Jesus was often a distant figure in stained glass, or a soft-focus character in a Hollywood epic. After Robert Powell stared into the camera, with those unblinking sapphire eyes, that was it. The world had found its Messiah, and it wasn't willing to let go. This success was not merely measured in ratings or awards, though it gathered plenty of both. It was measured in the way it seeped into the very fabric of global faith, becoming an annual ritual for families from every corner of the earth. The sheer scale of this phenomenon created a strange, lasting pressure on everyone who had survived the shoot. As the years turned into decades and we reached the milestone of this season, the revelations people went looking for were often scandals of the flesh or hidden scripts. But the real revelation was far more profound, and perhaps a bit more haunting. The cast finally opened up about the fact that they never truly left the production. They didn't just walk away from a job, they carried the residue of that spiritual intensity for the rest of their lives. For the surviving members of the cast, the truth revealed was that the production had acted as a transformative fire. They spoke of how the world treated them with a peculiar, almost frightening reverence that forced them to evaluate their own lives through a lens of impossible morality. They weren't just actors anymore. They were the custodians of a story that people used to get through the hardest moments of their lives. This final revelation is what truly defines the legacy of Jesus of Nazareth. It wasn't about secret affairs on set or suppressed footage. It was the realization that a group of flawed, cigarette-smoking professional actors had somehow, through a combination of Zepharelli's madness and their own physical suffering, captured lightning in a bottle. They had created something that felt more real to the audience than the history it was based on. Robert Powell, Olivia Hussey, and Ian McShane are seen not just as stars of a vintage hit, but as survivors of a psychological and spiritual marathon. They admit that the line between the performance and the self became permanently blurred. The thing is that they gave up their anonymity and their peace of mind to provide the world with a vision of hope that has lasted half a century. As we look back now, we see that the production was a singular event in human history, a moment where art, faith, and the brutal reality of the desert collided to create a masterpiece that continues to haunt, inspire, and define the face of the divine for a world that can't seem to look away. Are you on to a binge of this famous drama series? Subscribe and hit the bell to never miss our next deep dive into the legends of cinema.